Good evening. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood stated the country is facing a period of heightened tensions and division, so has granted police extra powers to, what she said was, tackle the repeated disruptive protests we have seen. This follows the new Green leader Zach Polanski's speech vowing to defend Britain from a descent into authoritarianism under Keir Starmer, warning that the Prime Minister should believe that our rights and our liberties were non-negotiable. Is there any truth to this? Let's speak to Russell Fraser. Russell is a criminal defence barrister with Garden Court Chambers, specialising in public order and protest. Good evening, Russell.
Good evening, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate your time. Well, the Home Secretary says the right to protest is a fundamental right in our country, and also says that she's giving police the power to ban protests if they deem them to have happened too often. Can you logically hold both opinions?
It's difficult to see how one can. Unfortunately, it's a refrain that we hear repeatedly from Home Secretaries when new powers are proposed and announced, that fundamental freedoms won't be affected and so on and so forth, but they continue to erode. And I'm afraid it looks like this is a new Home Secretary seeking to make a bit of a name for herself by going after, yet again, peaceful protest.
Is it an unusual thing for a Home Secretary to say that you can protest, but only a specific number of times to be decided at some future date?
Yes, it's not. What seems to be of concern to her is the repeated and ongoing nature of some protests. I'm not entirely sure which it is, looking at the Home Office's statement, but it presumably is events around Palestine. What has tended to happen with protests in the past, like Extinction Rebellion and so on, which have gone on for a number of days but then have come to an end. There have been, and the police have ample powers, let me assure everyone listening, to deal with those sorts of protests by placing conditions on them, such as where they can take place, how long they can take place for, how many people can participate, and where they must not go if they are also to be taking part. So there's no shortage of powers available to police.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just described doesn't really sound like freedom.
Well, speaking as I do, someone who deals with comes into contact with a lot of protesters and sees a lot of protesters who are perhaps being arrested a lot and so on, one doesn't want to give the impression that the rights to protest are completely under threat, because it would be wrong to create that sort of fear. But it's certainly a continuing erosion. People are still able to protest, but it's becoming more and more a position whereby the government say, well, you can protest, but we'd like you to do it this way. Thank you very much.
Which almost by definition is not protest. If you're protesting in the way that the government would like, well, that's not really protest, is it?
No, precisely. And look, the law recognises this, and there are some famous speeches and past decisions by judges about protests being messy, and those who are out of sympathy with them are bound to be annoyed by them and fed up with them and all sorts. But that's the price we pay for living in a democracy, where there may be a lot of people seeing a number of protests that have taken place in recent times, many of whom will be in sympathy with them, many of whom who won't be. But that's the society that we live in.
Yeah, you mentioned the protests about what's happening in Gaza. The arrests, numbering in their thousands, are for mostly peacefully holding pieces of paper with the words Palestine Action on them, not attacking the police, not setting fire to hotels. And they're done because the government has deemed Palestine Action to be a terrorist group, but refuses to tell us why they've come to that conclusion. Do you think that's odd?
Well, that's something that will be, as I understand it, I'm not involved in that particular litigation, but I have colleagues who are. And as I understand it, that's something that's will be ventilated in court in the hearings which are ahead. I think it's in mid-November. it's not a surprise necessarily that the government say we know about things that we can't possibly share with you, but trust us. There's a very concerning background to all this that needs to be taken into account, and judges can look at that evidence in what are called closed proceedings, but. It's often leaves civil liberties campaigners and lawyers like myself a little uncomfortable because, of course, we don't know what it is that they're referring to.
Have you any experience of so many people being arrested on protests that have been characterised by their peaceful nature?
Well, if one looks back to, yes, frankly, at the height of the sorts of direct action, peaceful protests we saw from the likes of Extinction Rebellion some 5 or 6 years ago, several people were arrested at that time. I suppose it was slightly different in that it was more of a it brought London to a standstill at times and so on and so forth. But with these protests, of course, what people are doing is sitting quietly, as you said, holding signs with a message on them, and have made it quite clear that that's what they'll be doing, and are emphasising the peaceful nature of what they're doing, and yet finding themselves being arrested. So as far as that sort of character is concerned, it's somewhat exceptional.
And just on the people who have been arrested, how might a conviction affect their lives?
Well, I mean, of course, any conviction has an effect on a person's future prospects. If they're young, if they're about to step into the workplace, if they're seeking to enter certain types of education. Obviously, a lot of the protesters appear to be retired people for whom it may have less effect. But, any conviction which may result from protests of this sort and which carries the stigma of terrorism is bound to be treated with a great deal of concern and caution by any number of different types of bodies or work or potential employers that a person may come into contact with in the future.
Do you think the government's painted itself into a corner, is surprised at the public's refusal to be cowed, and is now trying to arrest its way out of the mess it's caused?
I think there's ample evidence that is the case, because it seems to me that, for example, yesterday, the police obviously took an operational decision to have sufficient numbers of officers present in Trafalgar Square in order to arrest people. Obviously, the Commissioner and the Home Secretary made statements in advance of that protest, apparently hoping to dissuade people from taking part, which itself may also give rise to concerns about civil liberties. But at the same time, if the police were concerned about whether their resources were being diverted to Trafalgar Square at a time where they might have been needed elsewhere, then they could have taken that operational decision not to send officers to Trafalgar Square, particularly, as I say, where a peaceful protest is taking place, where there was no risk whatsoever of any disorder.
Yeah, governments in the past have always objected to protests concerning their actions or policies. But if the same standards of repression, if we can call it that, were applied before as they are now being proposed, would we have gay equality, women's ability to vote, religious freedom, racial equality, workers' rights, and everything won by not accepting what the people were given by their supposed betters?
Well, it's a strange dichotomy, isn't it, that we always find ourselves in, where at the time the people undertaking such actions are often condemned by various groups, and governments and authority find it difficult to know how to deal with them. But then sometimes years later they're viewed in a very different way. And I mean, who knows? It's certainly the case that there is a proud and long history of civil disobedience in this country, and many people would say that has affected positive political change in the country. Others may be less, we may be somewhat sceptical of that, but it's certainly an argument that can be had.
And were any of those rights won by just one march, because that is what is in the background of this proposal to limit the number of protests that particular groups will be allowed to make. If any group is, to take an extreme example, is only allowed to make one protest, well, it's not really going to change anything, is it?
Well, I think Shami Chakrabarti said something much to that effect today. That change has never been won or come about through effectively protesting according to how the authorities would like groups to do so. And it does seem very knee-jerk because, of course, I guarantee that at some point these protests will come to an end. They're somewhat exceptional in the way that they've taken place over the duration of the situation in Gaza. And there will come a time, who knows, that your news item just now suggested that a peace deal may be not far off being achieved. And if that's the case, it may be that these protests will come to an end and we won't see anything like it for some time. So that is another reason to question whether really this is something that is necessary. But as I say, the focus ought to be on the existing powers that the police have, and they have ample of them.
Do you think the Home Secretary was justified in saying that repeated protests leave sections of the community scared to leave their homes as a reason to restrict these protests? I mean, does a blind man, a vicar, and an 89-year-old woman holding a piece of paper make the residents of Westminster fearful of leaving their homes? Or is she implying that the existence of a protest anywhere can intimidate someone somewhere else? Or is she just tying herself in knots, trying to come up with some way to justify this sort of Trump-style crackdown?
It's possibly the latter. I mean, I'm probably looking at the same page of the Home Office website as you, and again, it will no doubt be uncomfortable to some that she purports to speak on behalf of the Jewish community, as it is put in the quote on the Home Office website. Now, most communities contain a diverse range of opinion about a number of different issues, and I'm sure the Jewish community is no different. So to that extent, again, as I said earlier, there will be people within any community who are entirely supportive of a particular protest. There'll be others who aren't. Maybe there are ways of managing it short of cracking down on protest itself. As you say,
sorry.
But could I just add as well? You mentioned Westminster, and I think it's important to emphasise also that one of the things that the law recognises is that not only is the right to protest important, but the right to protest within a reasonable distance of a particular thing that you might be protesting about, or in this instance, it's traditional, isn't it, to protest in places like Trafalgar Square, Whitehall, and Parliament Square, very close to the seats of power in this country, and that's obvious, and that's something that has to be borne in mind whenever the police are carrying out any restrictions.
We're in an odd position now because we're being attacked by the Trump administration. They published a report claiming that human rights and restrictions on free speech in the UK had worsened, which is kind of laughable under the circumstances. But more seriously, the United Nations say that they are concerned that counter-terrorism laws are being used on conduct that is not terrorist-related and risks hindering our fundamental freedoms. Are we becoming the kind of autocratic regime that we supposedly deplore?
Well, again, I don't want to alarm people unnecessarily. I mean, I think it may be a stretch to say that, but of course, when protests and particular types of protesters and issues are the protests which are routinely being targeted, because this isn't unique, this particular response from Shabana Mahmood today. The Labour and the Tory governments in the last few years have introduced new legislation in order to deal with particular types of protests, and it is a crackdown because they want to have less of it and be able to curtail it more effectively. But happily, I don't think we're quite on the road to autocracy yet. But it's not something that one is ever complacent about, because these things, the commissioner is asking for more powers. I've yet to see Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police ever decline a power when it's been offered to him by a Home Secretary. So I would be slightly concerned to see it gives pause for thought.
Good to talk to you, Russell. Thanks for that. Russell Fraser, criminal defence barrister with Garden Court Chambers, specialising in public order and protest.